monotheistic God of the Old Testament is being referred to consistently by the plural form of El, the head of the Canaanite pantheon. All of these El names suggest, to me at least, that the God of the patriarchs was in fact the Canaanite god El. If they worshipped El, presumably they worshipped his pantheon and were therefore polytheists. Jeepers, you might be saying to yourself, hold on, where did this Jehovah or Yahweh character come into the mix? Well, later, in Exodus, Yahweh introduces himself to Moses. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. This is one of the most surprising verses in the Bible. Here the God has to go out of his way to explain that he's the same God who appeared to the patriarchs. It's just that for unexplained reasons, he was going by a different name back then. Confusion about the name of a God is the last thing we would expect as part of a competent revelation. And that's especially so if what we have here is a monotheistic God attempting to educate his chosen people about exactly what monotheism is all about.
When somebody actually studies this Bible, I think that one of the things that they will realize if they studied it through archaeology and true history is that what you call Israelite people were actually Canaanite people. They did not come out of Egypt. The story of Exodus is not true. The only Egypt they came out of was that after the Bronze Age collapse, well, right before the Bronze Age collapse, and the Egyptians were defeated by the Phoenicians, they had to give up the Levant as their vassal state. And the Egyptians pulled out, and then the Bronze Age collapse happened, which caused civilizations to go into a downward spiral. And this downward spiral, with the Egyptians pulling out of the Levant, allowed for the different Canaanite clans to separate themselves. And what we're talking about is in and around the 1100 to 1000 BCE down to about 800 BCE time frame. That is when the Bronze Age collapse happened. Now, we're not sure as to what caused the Bronze Age collapse. It could have been a drought that caused the people from the seaside to move into the hillside. And that created many battles and wars between the different Canaanite people, whether it's the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, and all the other ites that are mentioned in your Bible. But historically, we know that the Hittites had to withdraw from their attempted conquest of the Levant, and that the Phoenicians and the Canaanite tribes warred against each other. The Philistines warred against each other. And out of this, you get your Israelite people who were hillside nomadic dwellers, and their fight against other Canaanites who were coming into their land and trying to possess it. But they were able to fight them off to a certain degree before they were eventually conquered by the Assyrians, and then later on the Babylonians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and you know the rest of the story, fighting between the Ottomans and the Europeans up until today. So the Israelite people really just separated what their ideas of El and Yahweh were, because Yahweh and El were Canaanite deities. And El, who was married to Asherah, had two sons. One of those sons were Yahweh and Baal. And then as they separated themselves, El became their primary god. And then El and Yahweh became merged into one god. And Yahweh was then married to Asherah for a while. And then Asherah was gotten rid of and turned into just a pole or stick by the time we get into the Babylonian captivity time frame. And so they then began to create Yahweh as El, as one God, the God, each time still relating to him as the storm deity. As they said, no longer shall we worship Baal, we shall now only worship Yahweh, because they were afraid of Yahweh and his devastation that he came with the storms. So the truth of the matter is that when Christians and Jews and even Muslims, when they speak of their God, who they are truly speaking of from the Canaanite perspective is the Canaanite deity from the Canaanite pantheon with their merger of El and Yahweh. This is not a group of people who were visited by some god and then given flight out of Egypt and established themselves as Israelites, being the children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But these stories were created in order to give themselves antiquity and to separate themselves from the other Canaanite people who were suffering during the Bronze Age collapse. And of course, those people, their scientific knowledge was such that they only believed that suffering came from the deities, that droughts came from the deities. They didn't understand weather patterns. And what is amazing is that people today are hedging their life on what people believed and wrote back then. Compare that to science. Science, we stand on the progression of information, the progression of knowledge, whereas religiously, spiritually, people are standing on the regression of knowledge and the regression of information, and they try to force it to fit their modern day interpretations. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.